Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. What we are witnessing is truly historic. We stand at the intersection of global politics, economics, and great power rivalry, and the stakes have never been higher. Under Donald Trump's leadership, the United States attempted to assert dominance in Latin America, particularly in Venezuela. But China has made a bold move, what I call its Venezuelan gamble, which now threatens U.S. influence not only in the Western Hemisphere, but across the global order. For decades, Washington has treated Latin America as its backyard, exerting political, military, and economic control. Venezuela, home to the world's largest proven oil reserves, has always been a central target of U.S. policy. The Trump administration's strategy, sanctions, regime change attempts, and international isolation was intended as a show of American power. Yet, instead of consolidating influence, it exposed flaws in Washington's approach and accelerated a regional shift few anticipated. When Trump took office, U.S. officials assumed Venezuela was ripe for regime change. Economic collapse, political division, and international isolation seemed to make Maduro's government vulnerable. The plan was straightforward: ratchet up sanctions, restrict oil exports, rally allies in Europe and Latin America, and quickly restore a pro-Western leadership in Caracas. It was meant to be swift, decisive, and symbolic of American strength. Instead, it became a textbook example of miscalculation. Washington deployed every lever: sanctions, diplomatic isolation, threats of military force, but Maduro endured, even strengthened. Sanctions crippled Venezuela's economy, but they also drove Caracas toward new allies, China and Russia. By trying to cut Venezuela off from the global financial system, the U.S. inadvertently opened the door for Beijing to extend loans, technological cooperation, and energy deals that gave Maduro breathing room. This failure also sent a global message. If maximum pressure could not break a mid-sized country in America's backyard, what credibility does Washington have against stronger nations? Trump promised a quick victory, yet years later, Maduro remains in power. Venezuela has diversified its international partnerships, and the U.S. looks weaker. Capitals in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East are now studying Venezuela as a model for resisting U.S. coercion. Historically, the Monroe Doctrine framed Latin America as U.S. territory. Trump's failure in Venezuela challenged that legacy, revealing limits to American dominance while China and Russia asserted themselves in Washington's once uncontested sphere. This is not merely a tactical setback, it is a structural shift. The foundation of U.S. authority in the hemisphere is being tested. Trump's sanctions also had a profound human impact. Intended to turn Venezuelans against their government, they instead caused widespread suffering, shortages of food and medicine, and economic devastation. The U.S. came to be seen not as a liberator, but as an aggressor, while Maduro framed the crisis as a struggle against foreign imperialism. This miscalculation solidified anti-American sentiment across the region. Trump's rhetoric was filled with bravado, threats, and promises of decisive action, but in practice, options were limited. Military intervention would have been disastrous, diplomacy lacked credibility, and sanctions created openings for China to expand influence. The Venezuela case exposes the gap between perceived power and actual capacity, revealing a superpower struggling to achieve its objectives in the face of new rivals. China's role in Venezuela is no accident. While the U.S. tightened the screws, China offered loans, infrastructure, and technology, turning isolation into integration. The centerpiece of this strategy is oil. Loans repaid in barrels of crude secure China's long-term energy supply, while insulating Venezuela from U.S. financial pressure. Beyond oil, China builds housing, telecommunications, and surveillance systems, creating threads of dependence that tilt Venezuelan sovereignty toward Beijing. China's presence sends a clear message: the age of uncontested U.S. dominance in Latin America is over. Despite risks, fragile economy, political instability, corruption, Beijing views Venezuela as a strategic prize. Every loan, every infrastructure project, every shipment of oil cements relationships that the U.S. struggles to undo. Where America relied on force and isolation, China built influence patiently and pragmatically, proving that 21st century power often comes not from coercion, but from strategy, resources, and long-term relationships. For more than a century, the U.S. assumed unshakable dominance in Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine warned foreign powers to stay out, enforced through coups, interventions, and economic pressure. Today, Venezuela challenges that assumption. Global rivals now contest U.S. influence not with small actors, but with resources, strategy, and determination. Trump's maximum pressure strategy failed, exposing the U.S. to multipolar competition as China and Russia stepped in, signaling that Latin America is open to alternative engagements. Other nations are watching closely. Venezuela's survival demonstrates that smaller countries can resist U.S. pressure without collapsing. Latin America is becoming a contested space in a multipolar world, and the harder the U.S. tries to tighten its grip, the more opportunities arise for others. What began as a local struggle has become a symbol of a global shift, a slow but steady emergence of multipolarity where U.S. dominance is no longer absolute. Washington relied on sanctions, threats, and isolation. Beijing relied on trade, investment, and technology. The results speak for themselves. The U.S. appeared punitive, while China appeared constructive. Venezuela leaned toward China not just for immediate relief, but because it saw a long-term partner focused on building rather than dismantling. Symbolism and optics, as much as material power, shaped loyalties across the global South. This shift is profound. Washington risks alienating populations it seeks to influence, while Beijing cultivates goodwill that lasts. Venezuela's survival under U.S. sanctions sends a powerful message: alternatives exist, and nations are not bound to a single system. For Trump, Venezuela was meant to showcase U.S. strength. Instead, it revealed weakness, exposed cracks in American influence, and highlighted the limits of coercion in a multipolar world. Ultimately, the struggle over Venezuela illustrates a larger transformation shaping the 21st century. The U.S. is no longer the undisputed center of gravity, and nations across the global South are exploring alternatives that challenge traditional dominance. China's patient, pragmatic approach contrasts sharply with America's coercive strategy, demonstrating that in a changing world, construction often outweighs coercion, hope outlasts fear, and strategic patience beats bravado. The contrast between Washington's approach and Beijing's strategy reveals the evolving rules of international influence. The U.S. relied on traditional levers, sanctions, threats, and isolation, tools honed over decades to assert dominance. But these tools were blunt, visible, and ultimately self-limiting. In contrast, China's approach was quiet, patient, and multidimensional. By offering loans, infrastructure, technology, and energy partnerships, Beijing positioned itself as a partner rather than a coercive force, reshaping the narrative of influence. This difference is crucial because in modern geopolitics, perception often shapes outcomes as much as tangible assets. Nations do not merely respond to coercion. They calculate benefits, consider alternatives, and watch how rival powers wield their influence. Venezuela's pivot toward China demonstrates that practical assistance, long-term investment, and visible solidarity can outweigh sanctions and threats. For the global South, this is a powerful lesson. Dependence on a single hegemon is no longer necessary. The symbolic value of China's actions cannot be overstated. While the U.S. attempted to isolate Venezuela, Beijing integrated it into a global network that bypassed traditional dollar-based finance, provided energy security, and delivered infrastructure. Each Chinese project in Caracas, from telecommunications to roads, is more than an economic transaction. It's a visible assertion of influence, a subtle but unmistakable challenge to American primacy. At the same time, the U.S. approach inadvertently reinforced Maduro's domestic position. By causing economic suffering through sanctions, Washington gave Maduro a narrative of foreign aggression to rally his population against. What was intended to weaken his regime instead strengthened it politically, illustrating a key paradox. Coercive measures can consolidate the power of those they seek to remove when alternative support emerges. This dynamic underscores the rise of multipolarity. In the past, American power often went unchallenged in the Western Hemisphere. Today, global rivals not only intervene, but succeed in establishing durable partnerships, signaling to other nations that U.S. dominance is negotiable. The U.S. no longer dictates the rules of engagement. Countries now have multiple pathways to development, security, and political alignment. The practical consequences of this shift extend far beyond Latin America. Leaders in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East are watching closely, seeing how a mid-sized nation resisted the financial and diplomatic might of a superpower. They observe that strategic patience, diversified alliances, and targeted investment can offset coercion, opening avenues for multipolar engagement. In essence, Venezuela has become a laboratory for the 21st century balance of power. China's long-term vision in Venezuela also highlights a new model of geopolitics, one where influence is built through integration, not confrontation. By embedding itself in the nation's energy infrastructure, technological networks, and trade systems, Beijing ensures a lasting foothold that transcends individual administrations or policy changes. This approach contrasts sharply with the episodic, high-profile tactics favored by the U.S., which rely on immediate impact rather than sustainable presence. Meanwhile, the United States faces a dilemma. Its traditional toolkit, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, military threats, is proving insufficient against rivals who offer alternatives. The Trump administration sought to demonstrate strength, but the outcome highlighted a structural vulnerability. American power is no longer automatic, and authority cannot be assumed simply because of historical dominance or military capability. The interplay of symbolism and strategy continues to shape outcomes. Venezuela's alignment with China demonstrates that perception matters as much as material assistance. Beijing's actions convey partnership, continuity, and opportunity, while Washington's sanctions signal coercion and constraint. Over time, these narratives influence loyalty, cooperation, and international alignment in ways that formal treaties or economic metrics alone cannot measure. As the multipolar order takes hold, smaller nations increasingly see that strategic choice, rather than blind allegiance, is possible. Venezuela's survival story serves as a template, signaling that U.S. pressure is not insurmountable and that alternative forms of engagement exist. This realization challenges centuries-old assumptions about hemispheric control and opens a space for creative, diversified foreign policy approaches worldwide. China's approach in Venezuela exemplifies the power of long-term vision over immediate results. Unlike Washington's rapid pressure tactics, Beijing's strategy relies on slow but steady integration, building interdependencies that endure beyond any single policy cycle. Loans repaid in oil, infrastructure projects, and telecommunications networks are not merely transactions. They are carefully designed mechanisms to ensure influence persists even amidst domestic or international volatility. This patient methodology contrasts sharply with the U.S.'s episodic, high-profile interventions, which often generate attention but fail to cement lasting authority. At the domestic level, Venezuela has demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Facing sanctions and economic isolation, the government shifted eastward, cultivating relationships with nations willing to invest and trade without imposing stringent political conditions. These partnerships, most notably with China and Russia, allowed Caracas to bypass traditional dependency on Western markets, maintain access to essential goods, and stabilize certain sectors of the economy. In doing so, Venezuela converted what many considered vulnerabilities into strategic leverage, showing that resilience can emerge from crisis when global alternatives exist. The human dimension of these policies is also striking. U.S. sanctions, while targeting the regime, often exacerbated the suffering of ordinary Venezuelans, deepening scarcity of food, medicine, and essential services. In contrast, Chinese investment provided tangible relief through infrastructure, energy, and development initiatives. This difference in impact shaped public perception, reinforcing the image of the U.S. as a coercive force and China as a reliable partner, a narrative that extends beyond economics into the realm of soft power and legitimacy. Internationally, Venezuela's pivot has sent ripples across the global south. Leaders in Africa, Asia, and Latin America now see that strategic autonomy is feasible, that American pressure can be mitigated, and alternative alliances leveraged for national benefit. This emerging paradigm represents a shift from unipolar dependency to multipolar negotiation, where smaller nations exercise agency in ways that were previously constrained. In essence, Venezuela has become a proving ground for a new order, demonstrating that calculated, patient investment can rival coercive supremacy. The strategic implications for the United States are profound. For decades, Washington assumed uncontested influence in the Western Hemisphere. Now it faces a reality in which authority must be negotiated rather than asserted. The failure to dislodge Maduro signals a structural vulnerability. Military might, financial dominance, and diplomatic pressure no longer guarantee compliance. As other nations observe these outcomes, U.S. leverage diminishes not only regionally, but globally, challenging assumptions about the effectiveness of traditional power projection. Beijing's gamble, meanwhile, is an exercise in both pragmatism and symbolism. By embedding itself in Venezuela's economic and technological infrastructure, China ensures a durable influence that extends beyond immediate transactions. At the same time, its presence carries a clear geopolitical message: the age of uncontested U.S. dominance in its own hemisphere is over. The symbolism resonates far beyond Latin America, signaling to emerging powers that alternative models of engagement, focused on partnership, development, and patience, are viable and effective. From a global perspective, Venezuela's experience illustrates the broader transformation of international relations in the 21st century. The world is no longer defined by singular superpowers dictating terms. Instead, influence is negotiated, alliances are diversified, and smaller nations increasingly assert strategic choice. This multipolar reality reshapes expectations, forcing historically dominant powers to recalibrate tactics and recognize the limits of traditional levers of control. China's approach also highlights the role of economic interdependence as a tool of influence. By intertwining loans, energy, and technology with Venezuelan development, Beijing created structural ties that are difficult to sever without significant costs. In contrast, U.S. sanctions, though economically impactful, are temporary measures that can be circumvented when rivals step in. The contrast underscores a key lesson in modern geopolitics. Enduring influence is often built through integration, not disruption. The symbolic stakes are equally important. Every Chinese oil tanker arriving in Caracas, every infrastructure project completed, reinforces a narrative of constructive engagement. Conversely, every U.S. sanction or threat reinforces an image of coercion. This narrative shapes global perception, influencing alliances, investment decisions, and political alignment. It demonstrates that power is not only material but also reputational. And in the modern era, optics can be as consequential as oil reserves or military might. Ultimately, the Venezuelan case exemplifies a shift in the mechanisms of power itself. Influence is increasingly exercised through patient, strategic, and tangible engagement rather than through unilateral coercion. The U.S. reliance on traditional tools has revealed limits, while China's deliberate long-term approach has expanded its reach, created new dependencies, and altered the balance of power. As other nations observe these dynamics, the lessons are clear. In a multipolar world, survival, influence, and strategic advantage require adaptability, patience, and a willingness to build rather than destroy. The United States' experience in Venezuela highlights a profound strategic miscalculation, assuming that economic coercion alone could dictate political outcomes. Washington underestimated both the resilience of Maduro's regime and the willingness of alternative powers, particularly China and Russia, to intervene. This miscalculation has forced a reevaluation of U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere, showing that material might, without corresponding strategic foresight, is insufficient. This misstep also carries reputational consequences. Globally, observers have noted the limits of American power in a highly connected multipolar world. Countries that previously aligned with U.S. strategies now reconsider the costs of dependence, weighing the potential benefits of engaging with alternative partners like China. The Venezuelan case becomes a cautionary tale. Unilateral pressure can backfire, strengthening the very actors it seeks to weaken. At a structural level, the U.S.'s inability to swiftly reshape Venezuela underscores the erosion of unipolar dominance. The Monroe Doctrine, which historically defined Latin America as a zone of uncontested U.S. influence, no longer carries the same weight. Beijing and Moscow's successful engagement in Venezuela demonstrates that global rivals can operate with impunity within what was once considered the U.S.'s exclusive sphere. This shift is not a temporary anomaly. It reflects a tectonic reconfiguration of global influence. The human dimension reinforces the stakes of these geopolitical maneuvers. Sanctions and economic pressure, while intended to target political elites, primarily affected ordinary Venezuelans, deepening hardship and suffering. This outcome inadvertently bolstered Maduro's narrative of resistance against foreign coercion, illustrating that the human consequences of policy choices directly shape political legitimacy and national sentiment. In contrast, China's investments in infrastructure, medical supplies, and development projects created tangible benefits, building local goodwill and political leverage. Strategically, China's patient engagement model contrasts starkly with the U.S. approach. While Washington relied on threats, sanctions, and isolation, Beijing deployed integration, long-term investment, and relational diplomacy. By embedding itself in Venezuela's economic and technological ecosystem, China ensured durable influence, one that is resilient to short-term political shifts. This approach demonstrates a key principle of modern geopolitics. Sustainable power is often structural, not coercive. The ripple effects extend far beyond Venezuela. Nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are taking note, reassessing the reliability of U.S. support versus the opportunities presented by alternative partnerships. The Venezuelan example offers a template for strategic autonomy, showing that states can resist coercion, diversify alliances, and secure development without full reliance on Western institutions. In this sense, Venezuela serves as both a laboratory and a beacon for multipolar engagement. For the United States, the lessons are sobering. Attempts to project dominance through rapid, high-profile pressure campaigns have revealed both practical and perceptual vulnerabilities. Material superiority does not automatically translate into political influence, especially when rival powers operate with patience, adaptability, and a long-term vision. The erosion of credibility in Caracas signals a broader challenge, maintaining authority in a world where power is contested across multiple dimensions: military, economic, technological, and reputational. The symbolic aspect of this struggle cannot be overstated. Every Chinese loan, infrastructure project, and oil shipment reinforces the narrative of constructive partnership, while every U.S. sanction or threat reinforces coercion. This difference shapes global perception, affecting not only how countries engage with these powers, but also how domestic populations interpret foreign influence. In the modern era, perception is power. Influence is often determined as much by optics and narrative as by material capability. In practical terms, Venezuela illustrates the limits of traditional policy tools. Sanctions can restrict immediate access to resources, but they cannot prevent rival powers from stepping in with alternative systems of trade, finance, and infrastructure. Military threats may create short-term leverage, but risk alienating populations and regional partners. In contrast, patient, consistent investment, economic, technological, and diplomatic, can secure influence over the long term, creating interdependencies that are durable and difficult to reverse. Finally, Venezuela's trajectory underscores the emergence of a truly multipolar world. U.S. dominance is no longer uncontested. Global influence is negotiated, contested, and increasingly shared among multiple actors. The country's pivot toward China and the resilience it demonstrated under sanctions serves as a powerful symbol of this transformation. It signals that alternative pathways exist, that influence can be cultivated through integration rather than coercion, and that the unipolar assumptions that underpinned U.S. foreign policy for decades must now be reconsidered. The U.S. experience in Venezuela also highlights a fundamental misalignment between short-term tactical thinking and long-term strategic outcomes. By prioritizing quick results, regime change, isolation of Maduro, and symbolic displays of power, Washington overlooked the adaptive capacities of its adversaries in the broader geopolitical environment. In contrast, China's patient, methodical approach underscores the importance of strategic foresight. Influence is best secured through sustained engagement, mutual dependency, and careful cultivation of local partnerships. The geopolitical consequences are profound. The Venezuelan case has signaled to other nations that U.S. coercion has limits and that alternative partnerships are viable. Countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America now recognize that they can secure development, technology, and financial support without fully aligning with U.S. policy preferences. This recalibration of alliances diminishes the leverage of unilateral Western actions, reinforcing multipolarity as an enduring feature of the 21st century international system. Moreover, the contrast between U.S. and Chinese strategies underscores a key lesson. Power is not only about capacity, but also about perception and legitimacy. While Washington relied on sanctions and threats, Beijing invested in visible, tangible benefits for Venezuelans, enhancing its image as a constructive partner. The optics of partnership versus punishment shape loyalties and political behavior, proving that influence in modern geopolitics depends as much on narrative and perception as on material capability. Venezuela's experience also illustrates the limitations of economic coercion. Sanctions may create immediate pressure, but they can also produce unintended consequences, including humanitarian suffering, anti-American sentiment, and the strengthening of rival alliances. In contrast, sustained engagement that addresses economic and social needs through loans, infrastructure, and investment can secure more durable influence while fostering goodwill. In this sense, the Venezuelan case becomes a blueprint for how rising powers project influence in a multipolar world. At the structural level, these events signify a historic shift. The Monroe Doctrine, long the cornerstone of U.S. authority in the Western Hemisphere, is now challenged in practice. Latin America is no longer an uncontested U.S. sphere. It is a contested arena where global powers assert influence according to their own strategies and long-term interests. This shift has global implications, signaling the erosion of unipolarity and the normalization of multipolar engagement, where smaller and middle powers exercise agency and select partners that serve their national interests. From a human perspective, Venezuela's story emphasizes that geopolitics cannot be divorced from social impact. Sanctions hurt ordinary citizens, creating political backlash and reinforcing anti-American narratives. Conversely, China's investments, whether in housing, technology, or medical support, enhanced local welfare and strengthened the legitimacy of Maduro's government. This demonstrates a critical insight. Successful foreign engagement must integrate political, economic, and humanitarian dimensions to achieve durable influence. For the United States, the lessons are clear. Material superiority alone is insufficient. Credibility, perception, and strategic patience are equally vital. Attempts to assert dominance through rapid coercion can backfire, weakening influence and creating opportunities for rivals. To navigate a multipolar world, U.S. policy must adapt, combining diplomatic engagement, coalition building, and long-term planning with selective use of coercive tools. The Venezuelan episode serves as a cautionary tale. The era of uncontested U.S. authority is over, and future influence will require nuance, foresight, and multilateral coordination. Looking ahead, the Venezuelan case offers a template for understanding emerging global dynamics. It demonstrates how rising powers like China can convert challenges into strategic advantages through integration rather than confrontation. It also shows how middle powers and smaller nations can exercise autonomy, resisting unilateral pressure while securing development and partnerships. The combined lessons for policymakers, strategists, and observers are clear. The 21st century international order is multipolar, resilient, and increasingly competitive. In conclusion, the story of Venezuela under U.S. sanctions and Chinese engagement is emblematic of a broader global transformation. Trump's maximum pressure campaign revealed the limits of coercion, while China's patient integration strategy highlighted the enduring value of strategic foresight, investment, and relationship building. The Venezuelan case underscores a profound reality. Power is no longer unipolar, influence is contested, and legitimacy is as critical as capacity. The era of unquestioned U.S. dominance has ended, replaced by a complex multipolar world where nations must navigate choice, partnership, and competition. The consequences of Venezuela's pivot toward China extend far beyond economics or energy. By accepting Chinese investment and loans, Caracas has signaled to the world that it can circumvent traditional Western-dominated financial systems. This is not merely a pragmatic choice for survival, it is a geopolitical statement. Venezuela demonstrates that a nation, even under intense pressure from a global superpower, can seek alternatives that secure both sovereignty and economic lifelines. The optics of this pivot are profound. Beijing is framed as a reliable partner, while Washington increasingly appears constrained and reactive. At the same time, this realignment reshapes regional perceptions. Latin American nations, long accustomed to U.S. dominance, now see a model of resilience that challenges long-standing assumptions. Countries observing Venezuela's survival recognize that their own political and economic decisions need not be dictated solely by Washington. This subtle shift in perception fosters a broader sense of agency across the continent, allowing smaller nations to explore partnerships with multiple powers without fear of immediate reprisal. China's patient strategy highlights a central lesson in contemporary geopolitics. Influence is rarely about immediate domination. By embedding itself into Venezuela's energy sector, infrastructure, and technology systems, Beijing has created a web of dependencies that is both economic and symbolic. These threads extend far beyond simple trade deals. They represent a deliberate construction of long-term influence. Unlike the U.S. approach, which relied on pressure and coercion, China's model demonstrates how strategic patience and targeted engagement can achieve durable geopolitical results. The human dimension of this story cannot be overlooked. Venezuelans, while enduring significant hardship under sanctions, now experience tangible benefits from Chinese investment, new housing, restored utilities, and technological upgrades. This contrast between deprivation under sanctions and constructive assistance from Beijing feeds into narratives of legitimacy and partnership. Political loyalty and social resilience are shaped not only by ideology, but also by immediate material realities. And in Venezuela, China has successfully leveraged this dynamic. Meanwhile, Washington's strategy exposes the limits of power in a complex, multipolar world. The assumption that economic leverage alone could dictate outcomes proved overly simplistic. Sanctions, threats, and isolation, while theoretically powerful, failed to compel the Maduro government to capitulate. Instead, they encouraged diversification of international partnerships, inadvertently opening the door for rival powers to expand their influence. The irony is clear. The very tools designed to enforce U.S. supremacy ended up diminishing its authority. Symbolism, as much as strategy, has emerged as a decisive factor. In the eyes of global observers, China embodies the power to build and invest, while the U.S. increasingly symbolizes constraint and limitation. This symbolic battle shapes alliances and perceptions across the global south. Governments weighing strategic partnerships are not only considering material benefits, they are also interpreting which power demonstrates reliability, foresight, and adaptability. Venezuela has become the lens through which this new global calculus is viewed. The broader lesson is that hegemony is no longer guaranteed by history or geography. The Monroe Doctrine, once a powerful assertion of U.S. authority, is increasingly symbolic rather than practical. China and Russia's interventions in Venezuela revealed that traditional spheres of influence can be contested even in regions historically dominated by a single power. The result is a recalibration of expectations. American dominance is no longer automatic, and multipolar engagement has become a defining feature of the contemporary world order. Venezuela's example also underscores the evolving nature of economic statecraft. Control over natural resources, access to credit, and infrastructure investment now intersect with geopolitical influence more directly than in previous decades. China's willingness to accept oil as collateral for loans, finance infrastructure projects, and integrate Venezuela into its global trade networks highlights a flexible approach to influence that contrasts sharply with rigid Western conditionality. In practical terms, these strategies make it increasingly difficult for the U.S. to reassert unilateral control. As this story unfolds, the consequences for global diplomacy are profound. Middle powers and smaller nations, observing Venezuela's defiance of Western pressure, gain confidence in pursuing independent foreign policies. They recognize that multipolarity offers practical alternatives and mitigates risks associated with relying exclusively on a single superpower. Over time, this dynamic erodes the structural advantages that the U.S. once enjoyed, compelling Washington to rethink its approach to influence, engagement, and coercion in the Western Hemisphere. Ultimately, the unfolding Venezuelan case serves as both a cautionary tale and a blueprint. For the U.S., it highlights the dangers of over-reliance on unilateral pressure and underscores the limits of sanctions as instruments of control. For China, it exemplifies the power of strategic patience, calculated investment, and long-term relationship building. And for the global community, it signals the emergence of a world in which influence is no longer concentrated in one capital or dominated by a single ideology. Venezuela, once a symbol of U.S. authority, has become a stage on which the 21st century multipolar order is being written.